Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult video number 397, the Psychopomp, a symbolic and religious sort of idea, the idea of a figure, or force, potentially. There's a lot of symbolism involved with it, and I have various feelings on the evolution of that symbolism. A being or a force that sort of takes your soul and takes it away after you die. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a positive thing. Of course, in ancient Greece, basically, you went to unless you were a hero going to the Elysian fields or something, and that kind of comes later. The underworld was kind of a gloomy place for the most part, in which you, sort of wandered around listlessly, and it was very Plutonian and kind of dark. Later on, religions sort of develop a different idea, which it was a heaven or something like that. Like Western religions. In the East, you have reincarnation and things like that, and the idea that you would be released from earthly burdens and stuff like that. But some of the early religions and even some of the modern ones had sort of a dismal outlook on the afterlife. The psychopomp is often represented as a bird of some sort. In Zoroastrian lore, with their funerary rites, it's very literal and explicit. The Zoroastrians practiced open-air burials, and so the charnel ground would have basically a stone slab, and the body's put there, and then it gets picked apart by the vultures. And what I think ended up happening with this particular imagery is that people literally observed that happening. So after the battle, the birds are coming and picking apart the corpses, and they sort of designed the mentality that because death is not necessarily it's a grisly thing, rotting corpses and stuff like that. So some people bury them to try to protect them from being, eaten by animals and vultures and stuff. In other cultures, it sort of evolves the concept that that's actually a positive process. Well, they ate this person's brain, and then they flew up and out into the sky. And they're taking them to heaven, basically. They're up in the clouds now. They're getting excreted all over the woodland, and people are growing crops on the dead people's bird shit. But, yeah, that's the more biological explanation, the more rational one. And the psychopomp takes other forms. There are some technical psychopomps as well. St. Peter would potentially be an example. Although in that case, you're not being transited to heaven. That's just you enter into it once your soul sort of flits up into the sky. And in older times, they meant literally the sky, as in the people were up there in the stars or in the clouds. And, of course, once we started flying up into the clouds, we realized that there aren't a bunch of angels up there. They're in a different realm, of course. Heaven has changed location. So has hell, actually. Hell was literally underneath the earth until fairly recently, and now hell is again. It's another realm entirely. It's on a different quantum string. It's a different reality. It's an invisible world, so to speak. Always thought it was funny, if you don't have eyes or a mouth or something like that, how you're actually supposed to sense the fact that you're in heaven. Again, I guess you just transit to another realm. So St. Peter would technically be an example. There are many others. Krishna, depending on how you interpret that particular lore. Shiva, to an extent. Hermes would be an example of a psychopomp. And of course, the deathly rower of Hades kind of serves a similar role as well. You're rowing across the river. You have to give them a coin, so they would bury people with a coin in their mouth so they could pay the rower to take them across. Otherwise, I think you had to swim and then drown in the Lethe or something like that. And anyway, those are some examples of psychopomps. Again, typically symbolized by birds, and I think that there's a literal biological tie-in. Oftentimes, I think that religious ritualism and symbolism evolves out of looking at the world around us and how it operates. This also causes changes in religions. Again, hell was a deep, fiery cavern, and people are seeing like volcanoes and stuff, and they're like, man, there must be some weird shit going on down there. Bad people go there and they burn in this magma for all eternity. And then later it becomes more symbolic as we realize there is no actual cavernous hell with Satan locked in ice like Dante's Inferno. Down there, it becomes an otherworldly realm, a spiritual realm in the literal sense. Angels could be conceived of as psychopomps, depending on Christian interpretation, or Islamic interpretation for that matter, or Jewish. Although in original Judaism, it's not really heaven and hell, it's literally the grave. When you die, you just sort of sleep. It's not unpleasant or particularly pleasant. It's just so, you're at rest. You don't have to work or get diseased or anything like that, so it's better than going to hell, I suppose. Most religions have some sort of concept. I can't remember. I think, was it the ancient Mayan religion? I don't think so. One of the Central American religious systems, they had the feeling that after a number of lives, you eventually turned into a moth, and then I believe disappeared entirely after some time and sort of went away to non-existence. Again, religions over time tended to start promising people a more positive outcome, assuming they followed the rules. That's generally the case. Then you get the evolution of religions that say, well, there's no judgment or anything like that, and you can consider this progress or regress away from some spiritual norm, depending on how orthodox you are in your religion. And there are a number of ceremonies and so forth in some religions that attempt to guide the process as well. In that sense, you could consider the shaman, the Tibetan monk potentially, to be a psychopomp as well. For instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, when a person dies, monks will come and they will chant certain things over them to try to remind them as they're wandering through basically the underworld of what they need to do. So to avoid fear, you go through one system of like caves and there's like monsters in there, and the monks are trying to remind you, hey, this is all in your head, they're not even real, so they can't hurt you, you're already dead. And then you go to a place where there's a bunch of like gods, literally, trying to tempt you, to seduce you, beautiful people, to try to get you to take a break, drink some wine, and have some sex. And they remind you not to be taken in by that temptation. And towards the end, you can choose to, if you get through it successfully and you've been virtuous, then you can choose to reincarnate, which is considered the most positive outcome. It's considered good. Or sort of ascend into a god realm of sorts. And of course, for the wicked, they can try to help you, but, you'll probably end up having some problems. You might reincarnate accidentally as a demon or as a hungry ghost. Hungry ghost, by the way, interesting too. So in that sense, they're psychopomps. Shamanism can be similar. It depends on the path. We could consider the Valkyries of Norse lore to be psychopomps as well, guiding you to one of a number of otherworldly realms, and you're really hoping that that realm is Valhalla, because then you get to spend all day slaughtering enemies, you regenerate, and then you go and brag at the feast about all the people that you killed that day. Norse mythology is definitely on the high end of interest with regards to what happens in the afterlife, as you will, till Ragnarok. Then everything recycles again. It's not actually an end times, so to speak. It's just an apocalypse. So yeah, the psychopomp, a very interesting subject, rich with symbolism. You can find examples from pretty much every religion of this. If you look hard enough. And for some of them, it's, again, like with Zoroastrianism, it's very, very explicit and even physical, or with Tibetan Buddhism, certain groups within Hinduism, or Egypt is a great example too. There they had little books with incantations that they would include with the dead body, just as a final example. And they were meant to guide you through the magical steps you needed in order to have a healthy afterlife and have your slaves with you and, your family members and stuff like that. You'd go to an afterlife in which work was easy and things were plentiful, and then you just sort of had a good life for your afterlife forever. But to get there, you had to not just be virtuous, you also had to go through a fairly convoluted process of magical incantations. Otherwise, you would not be able to find your way out of your tomb at all, let alone ascend to this other great undying land. And so that's a psychopomp. And towards the end, actually, this is an interesting archaeological fact, just in closing. Towards the end, because most people were illiterate, they were writing gibberish in these books, like they weren't even really trying. At first, it's very, very formal, but it appears that over time, the priesthood wanted to maximize profit. And so if there were some grammatical errors in the hieroglyphs in these books, they said, fuck it, basically, in these little codices, the scrolls that they would include. And so imagine that you die, you find out that Egyptian religion is actually the right one, and you wake up in your tomb and you're like, oh, I've got my magical inscriptions here. Ah, shit. Fuck you, scribe. That's about all. Peace out.